Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. For those here in person and virtual participants, I'm Dania Arayssi. I'm non-resident Senior Fellow at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. It's my privilege to welcome you to the launch of our policy reports after the fall of the Assad regime, how to prevent another sectarian authoritarian systems in Syria. The report was conducted in nonpartisan independent research on Syria based on firsthand data collections that Ava and I did. I want to encourage those in person to please take a copy of the report, the year, to get more insight on the reports. Just this week, we witnessed developments in Syria that underscore the relevance of the discussions. The new parliament in Syria start to take shape with numbers telling us a troubling story. Out of 250 parliamentary seats, only 4 right now are held by minorities: Christians, Alawi, Druze, and Kurds combined. 4 seats, only 4 seats. So much. For communities that together represents almost 26% of the population. This isn't just symbolic underrepresentation, it's definitely a warning signal. The consequences of exclusions are already manifesting in violence. In recent weeks, we have seen that the clashes in Aleppo, where sectarian tensions have emerged again. In Suwaida, the Druze heartlands massacres have occurred, and these aren't just isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a governance structure that we need to discuss today. Continue the exclusions of minorities from institutions responsible for protections definitely signal concerns about state representations in the future. This brings us together to the fundamental questions driving this report today. Is Syria transitioning from one form of sectarian authoritarianism to another? Are we simply watching Alawi dominance under al-Assad being transitioned and changed to a Sunni dominance under Al Sharaa government? With just a different distributions of power and same exclusionary kind of patterns to exploit challenges and potential pathways forwards, we have put together an exceptional panel that really represents diverse perspectives in the current Syrian situations. I want to welcome Faris Zwergerans from Princeton University, and he will help us understand more the Damascus perspective and the current situations in Damascus. Nadine Mainza from former U.S. Commissions on International Religious Freedoms will address U.S. policy implications and how the U.S. should engage in those conversations. Dr. Ahmad will also help us understand the Kurdish perspective and his research on the Kurds and the current situation there. We have 2 panelists joining us remotely. I guess they are, first we have Dr. Renwa Al-Shumadi. She is a PhD candidate and she's helped us understand the Jewish perspectives on these questions. And we have Muhannad also. He's done a lot of research on sectarian violence in Syria and will help us also understand those conversations. The Syrian people have endured decades of authoritarian rule and over decades of devastating civil war, and they cannot afford another transition to a sectarian authoritarianism. The choices made in the coming months by Damascus, by Washington, by regional power would determine whether Syria move toward inclusive governance or threaten into sectarian conflict zones. And that's why we are here to discuss this report today. So let's get started. We're going to start first with a presentations about the report that we worked on it, Eva and I. So to kickstart this presentation, main research questions that we were personally thinking about it when we start this report is, does Al Sharaa approach really represent a genuine representations and inclusions for minority, or just a symbolic representation to just put seats and give some numbers? Because this is really the fundamental questions driving this conversation today. And so we were just kind of trying to understand whether it's a Sunni control, like projecting this kind of inclusivity image to the international community. And why this question really matter today? I mean, we know why it matters for different reasons. First of all is the inclusions of minority in the system of governance really try to predict whether we're going to have a state stability and legitimacy in the futures, rather than kind of fragmentations and co-occurrence of violence. And the stability of Syria is not only a concern for the Syrians, but it's a big concern for the international for the whole region and the international community. And so this is really a core topic for today. The scope of this project was really focusing on, we were trying to collect data and understand government appointments actually in the current Sharia. So who is in the cabinet? Who had those cabinet positions? Who has those offices? We also looked into security institutions because this is an important. Who is in the military and who is in the intelligence? Who are appointed there? Who are those people? So we collected this data to drive this analysis. The constitutional framework, we studied and we looked into how the leader has this power of decision making. How is the power divided? Is Ishtara the main actor here, or the main actor, or we have more distributions of power with other individuals in the government? And so we were looking into whether we have a concentrations or diffusion of power in the government. And then finally, we looked at the violence patterns. We know that we have a lot of violence incident that happened in all over Syria, in Aleppo, in Suwaida. So we looked into those violence incident and patterns to kind of understand more about how this symbolic representation and inclusions of minority elements. And so we were, again, as I mentioned before, this report is a very nonpartisan data-driven report. So we wanted to look at what the data tell us, right? How do Syrians really feel in Syria? Do you feel safe? Do you feel secured? So looking at the data, first of all, we can see that this is based on ITANA, which is an institution that actually conducted the survey in Syria on the ground. They collected the data. And so they asked Syrians, do you feel safe under the current system of the Sharia? And 68% said yes. And 32% said no. But this is not the whole story here, because Eva will help us understand more into who are those people who said yes and who are those people who said no, who feels safe, who does not feel safe, and for who the safety is a major concern. Because the ongoing sectarian violence against minorities really signal a different story here that Eva would help us to understand more.
Thank you, Dania. So I wanted to zoom in a little bit on the sentiments of safeties among minorities in Syria. As you can see in this diagram, minority groups such as the Alawites, the Christians, Shia, and non-religious ethnic groups do feel predominantly unsafe in comparison to Sunni, their counterparts. So as you can see, 78% of Shias feel safe in their environments, while, for example, the Alawites, 80% feel safe. So this is a large issue and significant because of the potential of increased violence against minorities, which we've already seen, and the lack of representation of minorities in their community. It builds institutional distrust and can increase the potential for civil war and fragmentations. So our methodology included a comparative approach to data sources, and we focused, as Dania said, on the security, the judicial, and the cabinet composition, which included examining the constitution. So for our comparative approach, we compared the Assad regime patterns with Al Shara's government, and we found that the structures of the government are actually quite different. And Al Shara's government is pursuing a parliamentary approach in which we will see elections coming up in the coming weeks. So we also observed the demographic representation and the actual appointments that we see on the cabinets, which we will talk more about later. And for our data sources, we analyzed government appointments, and they're in the cabinet military, which includes the security sector, the intelligence sector, and police. And within the government appointments analysis, we identify their ethnic composition and their background. We also viewed the security incident documentation, so the violence patterns that we previously spoke about. We'll get into more. Third, we examined survey data on minority perceptions of safety, which we just discussed. And the fourth was the constitutional framework analysis. So this was really important because we examined the constitution and what Al Sharaa is doing in the government right now in the composition of the government.
Yes, and what we've learned from collecting this data on the cabinet, on the military, on these institutions, is numbers are not really a reflection of a meaningful, genuine representation for minorities. Yes, we have some minorities in the government. Yes, we have some minorities in the military, in the judicial, but this does not really reveal or reflect the genuine representation that can help Syria transition into a less violent country. So the first lesson is symbolic representation versus meaningful representation. So yes, as I mentioned, we have representation, but it's not meaningful, and I'm going to discuss more in this slides on what exactly is not meaningful, particularly looking at the cabinet representations. Who is in the yeah? If we can go back to the cabinet representation. Yes. So looking at the cabinet representations, who is in the cabinet who has the most important key functioning positions? We look at them and we can see the Sunnis or the members who have most important representations in cabinet. On the other hand, the minorities such as the Druze or the Alawite have kind of a secondary level cabinet positions. And so this signals that if you are not part of the decision making, if you don't have a seat on the table, you're not going to feel included and belong to there, and you don't feel that you have power in this conversation. And so this is a first kind of lesson that we find it. The security sector, which we're going to be covering later, read it, some other important kind of findings is the security institution. Most of the security institutions, if not all of them, do not have anyone inside the security except Sunnis. Most of the military and the securities, the head of those appointments are Sunnis. Then how are we expecting Yazidi, or sorry, Druze or Alawites or other minorities to feel safe when their protection and their safety are in the hand of one certain group of people? Then how are we expecting them to feel legit, feel protected if this is the situation in the governments? And this is based on the data that we collected. Constitutional architecture, which I know Eva would cover later on, most of the decision-making inside the government are in the hand of Ahmad Al Sharaa. All the power is concentrated in his hands. So that means we have a concentrations of powers. And we know from many examples that concentrations of power in the hand of one leader signals like a democratic backsliding or a regime instability or authoritarianism, right? We don't want a concentration of power, right? We want separations of power in the government institutions. And so having a one-man show, what are we expecting for the future of Syria? And so the exclusions create interventions opportunities, and we've seen this happening all over the time. Currently, we've seen what happened in Suwaida with the massacres. We've seen Druze getting support from Israel and getting military and financial support for Israel, and kind of signaling that they want to be part of this system. So this is creating opportunities where minorities are getting this external support. Foreign countries are taking this for their advantage to promote certain projects, to promote certain ideas, leading us to a fragmentation in Syria. Instead of having one privileged government where we are all part of the government, foreign actors are really taking this for their advantage. And so if we go back to the other slides, the one before, the one about like methodology. Okay, perfect. So if we look at the point number 5, what does really looks like? What is the situation in Syria going to look like? Well, the pattern is very clear and predictable. We have exclusions. Numbers say this. Data say this. This is leading us to violence incident happening everywhere in Aleppo and Suwaita. And foreign interference, also we know what's going to happen. And then the fragmentation. We're going to have, again, the fragmentations of Syria, fragmentation of the political system because of this whole system. Like, this is really the result. And so this is important to have these conversations into how can we include minority in the government, but I think most importantly, how can we build the trust? Rather than just minority, how can we build the trust and the actual conversation and deliberations for those minorities? And so this, the last point that we learned from this report is post-conflict transitions require intentional institutional design. So what does that mean? That means if Syria had went through a very serious conflict period where you can't just build an institutions and put minority in the institution and expect everything to work. It's important to have something called transitional justice conversations. How can we make these people feel belonging and feel that their grievances and what they went through is acknowledged? And so the importance of having this communication, deliberations with them, and community leaders feeling belonging to the system, I think it's very important here that this is really require not only like institutional design, but also like community engagements more. You can go to the next slide, which I think I already covered that slide, but yeah.
So the second finding that we had, we examined the security institutions. As I said previously, this includes the intelligence, the police, and military. So as you can see from this diagram, the red represents the Sunni majority, and the blue only represents one person who is in a low-level police position, and this is someone who's Druze. And this is also all critical security positions are held by Sunni members, and so there's no Alawite, Christian, or Kurdish representation senior security goal. This is a really big issue because the institutions meant to protect minorities are actually excluding them. And this caused a really big problem because the minority groups feel really unsafe in their environment, which we saw in the data previously. So the last finding that Raja recently referenced, we looked at the Constitution and Al Shara's constitutional power structure. So the concerns that we came up with were that the Constitutional Court, all the members are appointed by the president. Similarly, the cabinet ministers, all appointed and dismissed by the president. The Security Council, the president appoints and leads the council. The only difference is in the parliament, where a third are directly appointed by the president and the rest are chosen the president's appointed committee. And one thing that I want to note is the constitutional environment of that Islamic law as a legislative foundation. So the president must be Muslim, and this creates a lack of opportunity for ethnic minorities to get involved in the government and have any sort of their voices heard at a high level. So this also develops no institutional independence. So religious exclusion is constitutional and entrenched in their policies. And this also is a total power concentration in the president. So as you can see, every arrow flows to one of these power structures, and he controls all three branches of the government simultaneously.
Perfect. And so we did this timeline to look into what happened exactly in Syria. If you want to step back and just look at the big picture here. So Al-Assad regime fell in December 2024. In March 2025, we had the Alawi massacre and the violence against minorities. In May 2025, we started to see Israel, the airstrikes on Syria. And then in October 2025, we started to hear calls for separation with the government. So what is really the story here? What's going on to happen here? Exactly what we predicted before, that the continual exclusions of minority from the government in Syria is likely to lead to a fragmentation and hold for separations. And yes, we didn't do anything up. We ended a dictatorship regime under Assad. We are in new regimes where we continue to have those kind of fragmentations. Nothing really like a path toward a democracy in Syria and representation for everyone in Syria, which is, I guess, the ultimate goal that we want to see in Syria happening. And so the risk, as I mentioned, is Syria becomes a proxy battlegrounds where regional how really competing for this sectarian and clients. And this is definitely for Syria, for the Middle East security and stability, and of course also for the United States foreign policy in the region, and which is Ibn and Haka about it more, but particularly for counterterrorism and stability in the region, in those areas. We can go to the policy recommendations. Perfect.
Okay, so from the data, we create policy recommendations and we divide them in 3 different sections. So the first one is for the U.S. government, the second for the international community, and the third for Syria. So for the U.S., we recommend that the United States participates in conditional engagement on minority inclusion and security institutions. So this includes not only the cabinet, but also the security sector, the judicial sector, and in the constitution. So this is really important because it creates an incentive for the Syrian government, because without the engagement of the United States, which we haven't seen in years, this is a really big change. Without it, the United States will not participate, and that would be a really important shift. The second recommendation that we recommend that the United States supports the security sector reform with minority recruitment quotas. So this will be really important for the minority inclusion because it creates an incentive for minorities to get involved in the security sector, which we've seen is very limited with minority representation. Lastly, we recommend the United States targets economic aid to minority regions through Damascus. So this is also really important because not only does it strengthen the legitimacy of the relationship between the United States and Syria that is blossoming, but it also strengthens the legitimacy of Damascus into a different kind of economic slice than we've seen before. This also is the first time the United States in many years would be involving itself with Damascus, and also targeting economic aid to minority regions through Damascus also builds a better sense of community among all Syrians.
Perfect. And then for the international community and for Syria, On the international community level, I think yes, and the European Union have a lot of leverage and resources that they can use to kind of support the sanction relief to an actual measurable inclusion step that the government is doing. And I think from the other recommendation is you really to encourage and pressure Israel and Turkey and Iran to work through Damascus rather than undermining it, which I hear what I'm trying to say is not really using the Damascus or Syria as a battleground for the proxy projects. And of course, I think this is very, very, very important, transitional justice. Communities that have went through conflict, you can't build an inclusive system of governance. You can't have a peaceful, really democratic system of governance if you don't do transitional justice mechanisms. It's complicated. It's a long process. It's meaningful to actually build this. We've seen examples from the literatures on a lot of countries in former Yugoslavia, all these countries that went through civil wars, conflict, they had to go through transitional justice to kind of build system of governance. And then lastly, for Syria, it's important to amend the constitution to guarantee proportional representations. I know there's concerns about proportional representations from examples of Lebanon, but in other cases where proportional representation really signaled a failure in examples, but we need some sort of a political system to kind of guarantee certain seats based on the population representation that can help us to get started. It doesn't have to be the only system of governance, but we need certain representation that people feel included in the system. I think we should important talk about quotas in the judiciary, police, and the military. We talk about it this all the time when we talk about minority representation or gender representation for women. Quotas is one policy mechanism that we use in politics to include representation in the system. And finally, reform educational curriculum away from an Islamist approach to kind of an inclusive message. Recognizing that the entire community is not only represented in one sect or one religion, and we have diversity in this community. Perfect. I think this is our report. I think we're gonna get started with our panelists.